30 people were gathered around the long dining table, their laughter filling the room. It was Logan's 36th birthday, a milestone that should have been filled with warmth and celebration. The crisp autumn wind rattled against a window pane that someone had left unlocked, but inside, the room felt cozy and bright. Sitting right beside me was Martha, wearing her absolute favorite cream-colored dress, the one with the delicate pearl buttons down the front. She had been saving that dress for an occasion that truly mattered. That was just who she was. She always saved the best things for the people she loved, transforming ordinary days into lasting memories. She had spent the entire afternoon baking a traditional 3-layered German chocolate cake from scratch. It was the exact same recipe she had lovingly prepared for Logan every single year since he was a small boy. I remembered watching her in our kitchen that morning, carefully measuring out the shredded coconut, checking the consistency of the frosting, and making sure every single detail was flawless. She poured her heart into that cake because her son deserved nothing less. But Evelyn, our daughter-in-law, had other plans for the evening. The moment we arrived, I watched her glance coldly at the cake in Martha's hands. With a sharp, dismissing tone, she told her to take it straight to the kitchen and leave it on the back counter with the extra supplies. She said it with a casual cruelty, as if Martha had brought something cheap and embarrassing from a local supermarket instead of a masterpiece she had spent hours crafting with her own hands. I saw Martha's face fall just for a fleeting second, but then she quickly forced that small, tight smile she always used when she was trying to swallow an emotional blow. Without a word of complaint, she carried her cake to the back room. Looking back, I should have intervened right then. I should have stood up and asked Evelyn what on earth she thought she was doing. But I hesitated. I convinced myself that it was just a minor misunderstanding, that Evelyn was simply stressed out from hosting 30 people, and that it wasn't worth causing a massive scene on our son's special day. It was a mistake I would soon regret. The dining room remained incredibly loud, filled with the boisterous voices of Logan's colleagues from his construction management firm and Evelyn's wealthy real estate associates. In fact, the guest list consisted far more of her social circle than his. I recognized quite a few familiar faces from around the neighborhood. Marcus Vance was there, near the center of the table, laughing with his wife Chloe. Arthur Brooks had brought over an expensive bottle of aged bourbon to mark the occasion. Sitting right next to me was George Miller, who was eagerly recounting a chaotic story about a commercial job site from back in the late 90s. Everyone around the table was chuckling, and to any outsider, the entire gathering looked exactly like a picture-perfect family birthday celebration. Yet, an uneasy sensation settled deep in my gut. I felt the tension building long before I truly understood what was happening, the exact way a person senses an oncoming storm before the very first drop of rain hits the ground. When Martha finally returned from the kitchen and took her seat, I noticed her hands were trembling. It wasn't an obvious shake, just a subtle tremor that became undeniable when she reached out to pick up her glass of water. Underneath the concealment of the table, I placed my hand firmly over hers to offer some comfort. I leaned in and softly asked if she was doing okay. She gave a quick silent nod, but refused to look me in the eye. Meanwhile, George was still deep in his story. Wine glasses were being refilled down the line, and Evelyn sat proudly at the head of the long table, smiling radiantly at a comment made by one of her real estate partners. Logan sat right beside her, effortlessly cutting into his steak, looking completely relaxed and blissfully happy. Then, right in the middle of dinner and right in the middle of George's sentence, Evelyn suddenly stood up. The welcoming smile was entirely gone from her face. She fixed her gaze directly at Martha and spoke with a piercing volume that instantly caused every single conversation in that crowded room to completely stop. She looked at my wife and told her to get out of her house. It wasn't a polite suggestion about wrapping things up early, nor was it an excuse about having a busy morning ahead. She explicitly commanded my wife to get out, projecting those harsh words directly at the woman who had spent her entire afternoon baking a birthday cake for her only son. Martha's face went entirely white, and her hand turned ice cold beneath mine. She immediately turned her eyes towards Logan, her boy, the son she had raised from infancy, the child she had guided through college and fiercely supported through every single challenge he had ever faced. She looked at him and simply waited. She waited for him to speak up, to challenge his wife, to demand an explanation for why he was treating his own mother this way. She waited for any sign that he would protect the woman who gave him everything. Instead, Logan kept his gaze locked tightly onto his plate. He cut another piece of meat and chewed it slowly, acting as though he hadn't heard a single word, pretending his wife hadn't just humiliated his mother in front of 30 people. But he had heard it. Everyone in that room had heard it. The entire dining room was frozen in absolute silence. 30 guests sat completely paralyzed, forks suspended halfway to their mouths, and wine glasses held mid-air, all of them staring at my wife in utter disbelief. A cold weight settled heavily into my chest. It wasn't rage yet. It was something far worse. Recognition. I realized in that moment that this wasn't the first time Evelyn had treated her this way. It was just the first time I was witnessing it in front of a room full of people. Martha stood up with deliberate slowness. Her frame was shaking, but she refused to shed a single tear in front of them. She possessed too much dignity for that. But her body trembled as if she were standing outside in the bitter autumn wind, rather than inside a beautifully heated home filled with people who claimed to be family. I reached out and took her freezing hand. I didn't waste my breath arguing with Evelyn, and I didn't ask Logan why he sat there acting like a total stranger during his mother's deepest humiliation. I gently guided her to the front hallway closet to retrieve her winter coat. Her fingers were shaking so violently that she couldn't even manage the buttons. I took over, fastening them one by one, deliberately taking my time because I desperately needed those extra few seconds to decide exactly what I was going to do when we reached that front door. 30 pairs of eyes tracked our every movement as we crossed back through the dining space. Not a single person spoke up. These were people I had known for years, people who had dined at my own table, neighbors whose children I had helped secure employment for, colleagues who had called me countless times for business advice and personal favors. Every single one of them just watched in silence. At the front threshold, I stopped. I turned around completely and forced myself to look at every single face in that room, making direct eye contact with each of them. I wanted them to see me seeing them. I wanted them to understand exactly what kind of malice they were choosing to endorse by remaining silent. Finally, I looked down at my son. Logan still refused to meet my gaze, keeping his eyes glued to his plate as if it were the most important thing in the world. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was so incredibly quiet that my words carried perfectly to every corner. I looked at him and said that this would be the absolute last time he would ever see me walk out of a room. That was all. No screaming, no elaborate threats, just a plain statement of fact. I gripped Martha's hand tightly, and we walked out into the night. We were only halfway down the driveway when the quiet was broken by the sharp, heavy sound of a chair scraping against the hardwood floor inside. Then came another, followed by an immediate rush of voices and hurried footsteps. Marcus Vance appeared in the brightly lit doorway, having pushed his chair back with such force that it nearly crashed to the floor. He bluntly told his wife they were leaving right that second. They marched past Logan and Evelyn without offering a single word of goodbye, completely bypassing them on their way out. Right behind him, Arthur Brooks stood up, followed immediately by George Miller and then Clara Martinez, one of Evelyn's primary corporate real estate contacts, a woman Evelyn had explicitly invited to the dinner just to network and impress. One after another, chairs scraped back, heavy coats were snatched from the rack, and guests began streaming out into the night. There were no polite excuses offered, no awkward apologies made to the hosts. It was simply a collective group of adults making an immediate, silent choice about the kind of behavior they were willing to sit and tolerate. By the time I finally helped Martha into the passenger seat of our car, 18 of the 30 guests had already walked out of Logan's birthday party. I drove us home in absolute silence. Martha kept her eyes locked on the passenger window, watching the blur of the passing streetlights reflected in the dark glass. She didn't cry, and she didn't speak, acting as if she were trying to process an impossible reality. It was only when I finally pulled the car into our own quiet driveway and cut the engine that she broke the silence.
Her voice was incredibly faint, barely a whisper in the dark vehicle. She looked straight ahead and told me that this wasn't the first time it had happened. I sat there in the stillness, waiting for her to continue. She explained that Evelyn had been subtly cutting her down for the past 2 years, always ensuring it happened the moment I stepped out of the room. Evelyn would constantly tell her that she was far too involved in their lives, that she desperately needed to start respecting personal boundaries, and that Logan didn't need his mother dropping in or interfering anymore. My grip tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Martha's voice cracked slightly as she admitted that just last month, Evelyn had told her she dressed far too old-fashioned to attend our son's school events, and that she was actively embarrassing the family. After that, she confessed, she had simply stopped showing up. She had genuinely believed that if she just gave Evelyn enough space and stepped back quietly, the tension would ease. She had held on to the hope that Logan would eventually notice the distance and say something to fix it. But the realization that crushed me from the inside out was that Logan had noticed. He had known all along. He had simply chosen his wife over his own mother, over and over again, allowing a steady stream of private humiliations to occur because there was no one around to see it. He had tolerated it because it was kept in the dark, until tonight when his wife foolishly dragged it out into the light in front of 30 witnesses. I asked her why she had never brought this to my attention before. Martha looked at me, her eyes completely dry but deeply bloodshot, and said it was simply because he was our son. She explained how she kept convincing herself that the situation would improve with time, that perhaps she was just being overly sensitive, and that families often hit rough patches you just have to endure. In that moment, everything that had unfolded over the past 24 months finally made sense to me. I suddenly realized why Martha had stopped bringing Logan's name in conversation, why she had become so quiet whenever we discussed holiday plans, and why she had started asking for explicit permission before calling him instead of just picking up the phone. She had been systematically shrinking her presence in her own son's life, and I had completely failed to notice. Martha quietly gathered her things and went inside the house. I stayed behind, sitting alone in the dark car for another 20 minutes, just staring blankly through the windshield at the garage door. Suddenly, my phone began to vibrate continuously against the console. A barrage of text messages was flooding in from Marcus, Arthur, George, and even Olivia, Martha's longtime friend who had been seated near the end of the table. I didn't open them. My mind was entirely consumed by a completely different realization, one that had been steadily hardening since the exact moment Logan had looked away from his mother's face. I began thinking about Logan's business, the regional construction management firm he was so incredibly proud of, the one that had expanded rapidly over the last 8 years. He now had several full-time employees, massive contracts with major commercial real estate developers, a beautiful office suite downtown, and his own name painted on the glass door. Jogan genuinely believed he had constructed that entire enterprise through his own raw talent and sheer willpower. But I knew the real story. I was the one who made the initial introductions, placed the critical phone calls, and personally opened every single door for him. Logan certainly had the formal education and the baseline skills, but he had secured his first 3 career-defining commercial contracts solely because the name Arthur Brooks and the word of my own reputation carried immense weight in our regional development community. Arthur's firm, along with several other major local developers, had taken a massive financial chance on an unproven 30-year-old manager entirely because I had stepped forward and personally vouched for him. I had assured them that the boy was capable, that his word was ironclad, and that he had been trained by the absolute best in the business. Logan thought he was operating on his own established legacy now, but he was about to discover just how incredibly wrong he was. I chose not to call Logan that evening. I didn't send an aggressive text message, and I certainly didn't plan to storm into his downtown office on Monday morning to cause a scene in front of his staff. That was precisely what Evelyn would be expecting, a loud, emotional confrontation filled with shouting and dramatic threats. It would give her something to twist when talking to her friends, a weapon to make Martha and me look like the unstable ones.
Instead, I took a completely different path. First thing Monday morning, I drove directly to Arthur Brooks's corporate office without an appointment. I walked into the main lobby and calmly asked the receptionist if Arthur had a few minutes to spare.
She recognized me instantly as I had been doing business in that building for over 15 years, and she radioed back to his private office. Arthur came out to the lobby immediately. The moment he saw me standing there, the look on his face changed. He knew exactly why I was there. Everyone who had been at that dinner table understood the gravity of what had occurred. He gestured toward the back hallway and told me to come on in. We walked into his private office, and Arthur closed the heavy wooden door behind us. He sat down behind his expansive desk, looked at me intently, and waited for me to speak. He sighed heavily, admitting that Saturday night had been an absolute mess, and expressed how incredibly sorry he was that Martha and I had been subjected to that kind of treatment. I looked right at him and replied that I wasn't there to discuss the events of Saturday. Arthur raised an eyebrow in surprise. I clarified that I was there to discuss Logan's upcoming contract renewal for the commercial development project on Elm Street. Arthur's entire demeanor shifted. The Elm Street Commercial Plaza was the absolute largest active contract Logan's firm possessed. It represented 18 months of guaranteed work and over $500,000 in management fees. The contract was scheduled for renewal in November for the second phase of development. Arthur started to speak, but I cut him off gently. I told him I wasn't asking him to terminate Logan's contract immediately. I was simply asking him not to renew the agreement once the current phase concluded. I pointed out that he had 4 full months to transition the project to a different management firm, which was more than enough time to handle the handoff seamlessly. Arthur leaned back deep into his leather chair, studying my face intently, as if trying to find a catch. He asked if I was completely serious about this. He pointed out that Logan had consistently delivered excellent work for his firm, that there were no official complaints, and that his projects always came in on time and under budget. He stated he had no legitimate business reason to let him go. I told him he didn't have to fire him, he just needed to decline the extension for the next phase. I suggested he inform Logan that the firm was restructuring its external operations, bringing project management in-house, and that while they appreciated his work, they were moving in a different direction. I assured him I wouldn't speak poorly of Logan and that Arthur could even provide a positive reference if anyone called. I just wanted the workflow to stop. Arthur remained silent for a long time, looking out his large window at the construction site down the street, where the structural steel frames were already rising. It was Logan's project, clean, efficient work. Arthur finally spoke, asking flatly if this was happening because of what his wife had done. I looked him dead in the eye and told him it was happening because my son sat there and watched it happen. Arthur nodded slowly, rubbing his face with both hands. He reminded me that I was the one who had taught the boy everything he knew about managing client relationships, talking to contractors, and establishing professional trust. He noted that all of it had come from watching me work. I told him I knew that, but my son had completely forgotten the most important lesson of all. I stood up from my chair and said that a man protects his people, especially his family, and if he fails to do that, absolutely nothing else matters. Arthur let out a long sigh, relenting. He agreed to make the formal call in August, giving Logan a full 2 months' notice before the contract officially expired in November. He asked if that arrangement felt fair to me, and I told him it did. I shook his hand and turned toward the door. As my hand touched the handle, Arthur called out my name. I turned back around. He told me that for what it's worth, half the men in that dining room on Saturday night would have done the exact same thing I was doing, and some of them were already taking action. I froze, asking him exactly what he meant by that. Arthur explained that Marcus Vance had called him the previous afternoon, specifically asking if Logan had any pending contracts or upcoming bids with Vance & Sons. Arthur had told him no, not at the moment, to which he had simply replied, "Good, keep it that way." A strange sense of clarity settled deep into my chest, the exact same feeling I had experienced when those 18 guests walked out of the birthday party. It was the realization that I wasn't alone in this. What Logan and Evelyn had done hadn't just insulted my wife, it had deeply offended the core values of every single person who had witnessed it. In our regional construction industry, reputation and character are absolutely everything. Logan's professional standing had just taken a devastating blow, and no amount of good project management was ever going to repair it. I made 4 more private visits over the course of that week. I sat down with Jim Peterson at Midwest Development, Carol Vance at Prairie Stone, and Gene Harmon at Valley Electrical, the exact people Logan worked with on a regular basis. These were the industry leaders Logan honestly believed were his own personal contacts. I didn't ask any single one of them to terminate his active contracts, nor did I badmouth his capability or attempt to actively sabotage his daily operations. I simply made it incredibly clear that I would deeply appreciate it if they looked into other project management firms for their upcoming ventures. I also explicitly informed them that if any future issues arose regarding Logan's business, I would no longer be standing behind him or vouching for his character. That single conversation was all it took. You see, what Logan never truly understood about the commercial construction industry in a mid-sized American city is that it doesn't actually run on legal contracts. It runs entirely on personal relationships and mutual trust. It operates on 30 years of showing up on a job site, keeping your word, and treating people with basic human respect. Logan had merely been borrowing my lifetime of relationships, and now I was systematically taking that loan back. By Friday afternoon, Logan still retained every single one of his active accounts. On the surface, absolutely nothing had changed. His crews still showed up to the sites, his downtown office remained open, and the commercial plaza project was moving forward right on schedule. But the future pipeline, the upcoming bids, the lucrative contract extensions, and the new developments that were still in the casual discussion phase, that entire pipeline was rapidly drying up. Local developers were suddenly scheduling introductory meetings with his direct competitors. His phone calls weren't being returned with the usual urgency. Whenever Logan's name was brought up in morning contractor meetings, executives were suddenly remembering other independent project managers they had been meaning to try out.
Martha knew exactly what I was doing during those days, and she made no attempt to stop me. But on Thursday afternoon, while I was away handling a private consulting call on the north side of town, she finally cracked. She sat down at the kitchen counter, picked up her phone, and dialed Logan's direct number. She had spent days telling herself she wouldn't do it, that she needed to give him space, and that surely her own son would realize the gravity of his mistake and reach out to apologize first. But the maternal instinct was too strong, and she placed the call anyway. The phone rang 4 full times before transferring directly to his automated voicemail. Martha quietly hung up without leaving a single word. When I finally walked through the front door later that evening, she was standing at the sink washing the dinner dishes. I recognized the look on her face the exact moment I entered the room. It wasn't simple sadness. It was the specific, crushing look of someone who had reached out for her child and found absolutely nothing but empty space. I didn't press her for details, and she didn't offer any. I simply grabbed a clean dish towel from the drawer, stepped up to the counter, and began drying the plates beside her in total silence. It was only much later that evening, long after the last of the dishes had been put away and I had brewed a fresh pot of coffee, that she finally spoke up. We were sitting opposite each other at the kitchen table, enveloped in the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it has actual physical weight. Martha kept her eyes locked on her hands, which were wrapped tightly around her ceramic mug, as if she were desperately trying to warm them, even though the kitchen itself wasn't cold at all. She admitted softly that she had called him on Thursday and that he hadn't answered. I carefully set my coffee cup down on the table, keeping my voice completely steady, and waited. Martha looked up then and told me she wasn't asking me to stop what I was doing to protect her. She explained that she just needed to know if he would still pick up the phone for his mother, if he would do at least that much. She paused, her voice faltering for a moment, before whispering that now she had her answer. I reached across the wooden table and placed my hand firmly over hers. After a brief moment of quiet, she finally voiced the one question I had been actively trying to avoid thinking about since Monday morning. She asked what would happen when Logan eventually figured out what I had done. I looked at my wife, my expression serious, and told her that when that day came, our son would simply have to decide whether his wife was truly worth everything it was going to cost him. 3 weeks later, on a chilly Tuesday afternoon in early November, the situation finally boiled over. I was out in the garage, systematically organizing my tools and clearing off a cluttered workbench that I had been promising myself I would clean out for the past 6 months. The autumn leaves were almost entirely gone from the trees now, and the wind cutting through the open garage door had that sharp, bitter edge that meant winter was coming, whether we were ready for it or not.
Suddenly, a heavy pickup truck pulled rapidly into the driveway, and the driver's side door slammed shut with a loud, aggressive thud. I knew exactly who it was before I even turned around to look. Logan stood near the edge of the concrete, his arms crossed tightly over his chest and his face rigid with anger. He looked noticeably thinner, and his jaw was clenched so hard that I could see the muscles in his face twitching. He looked at me and said sharply that we needed to talk right now. I slowly set down the heavy wrench I was holding, leaned back against the solid wood of my workbench, and told him I was listening. He wasted no time, shouting that Prairie Stone developers had just informed him they were pulling his firm from the Riverside commercial project, opting to go with a direct competitor instead. They hadn't given him any real explanation, just a generic statement about deciding to take the development in a completely different corporate direction. I remained completely silent, watching him. Logan's voice continued to rise, his anger escalating, as he revealed that this was the third major contract he had lost in a matter of 2 weeks. He told me that Arthur Brooks had called him the day before to announce a complete restructuring after the Elm Street project wrapped up, that Jim Peterson hadn't returned his calls in 10 days, and that Carol Vance had completely canceled their strategy meeting without offering to reschedule. He stepped closer, his face flushed, and accused me of poisoning his business relationships, claiming I was going behind his back to everyone in the city to ensure he wouldn't get hired. I kept my posture relaxed and my voice perfectly level. I looked at my son and told him I wasn't poisoning anything. I was simply no longer vouching for his character. Logan snapped back that it was the exact same thing, but I firmly corrected him. I pointed out that if I were actively trying to ruin him, I would be telling these developers that he was completely incompetent, that his crew couldn't be trusted, and that they should terminate his active contracts immediately. I hadn't said a single word against his professional capabilities to anyone. Logan's hands began to shake with frustration, and he demanded to know exactly what I had said to them then. I told him the absolute truth. I had informed them that I was no longer in a position to personally recommend his firm, and that they would have to make their own independent choices regarding his employment from now on. That was all it took. Logan threw up his hands in disbelief, demanding to know why I would do this over one bad evening, claiming Evelyn was just stressed out. My jaw tightened, and I stood up straight, abandoning my relaxed posture to look my son dead in the eye. I corrected him instantly, my voice carrying a sharp edge. I told him his wife didn't politely ask anyone to leave. She publicly demanded his mother get out in front of 30 people, neighbors, colleagues, and the very developers he relied on for his livelihood. And through all of that, he had sat there like a coward, completely silent. Logan's face turned a deep crimson as he tried to justify it, stammering that there were underlying boundary issues and tension that had been building for months. I raised my hand, cutting him off with a single, sharp command to stop. The words sliced through the air like a blade, instantly silencing his excuses. I told him I had no interest in hearing him defend that behavior because I was in the room. I had seen his face, and he wasn't shocked or confused. He was simply hoping no one would make a scene so he could protect his own comfort. I asked him point blank how long Evelyn had been mistreating his mother in secret. Logan looked away, refusing to answer, muttering that the situation was complicated. I told him it wasn't complicated at all. His wife viewed his mother as an inconvenience to be managed, and he allowed it to happen because it was easier than having a difficult conversation at home.
Logan's hands curled into tight fists, his voice cracking with a mix of rage and desperation as he accused me of destroying the empire he had built over 8 years. I looked around the garage, then back at him, and reminded him that those 30 years of industry relationships belonged to me, not him. He had merely been trading on my good name. He claimed he had earned every contract himself, but I reminded him that developers like Arthur Brooks and Jim Peterson had only taken a chance on an unproven 30-year-old because I had put my reputation on the line for him. I told him his work was fine, but his resume hadn't opened those doors. My signature had. He fell silent, his face going pale as the reality finally began to sink in.
He asked if I was really going to ruin him and burn down his entire life just because his mother's feelings were hurt. The dismissive phrase felt like a physical blow. It proved he still didn't understand the difference between a minor social slight and a deliberate act of public humiliation. I picked up my wrench again and turned back to the workbench, keeping my back to him so he wouldn't see my own hands beginning to shake. I told him he got to keep his education, his skills, and his active contracts, everything he had actually earned on his own merit, but my reputation was never his property to keep. Logan stood frozen behind me, his chest heaving as he struggled to find some leverage, some desperate argument that would make this nightmare go away without forcing him to look at his own failure. Finally, the anger drained from his posture, replaced with a hollow desperation. He asked what I wanted him to do. I turned around slowly to face him. I told him to go home and really think about what had happened at that dining table. I told him he needed to decide whether he was a man who protected his family or a man who allowed them to be broken down just to avoid an argument with his wife. Logan's voice cracked completely as he admitted his terrifying reality. Evelyn had already threatened to leave him twice if he pushed back against her, and if he took our side, she would walk out. There it was. The ugly truth he had been hiding behind his silence all along. He wasn't protecting his marriage, he was acting out of sheer terror of losing it. A profound sense of grief washed over me, heavier than any anger I had felt. I looked at my only child and told him that if his wife had him so terrified that he was willing to sacrifice his own mother to keep her happy, then his marriage was already over. He just hadn't realized it yet. Logan's entire body went rigid, his hands trembling as he shouted that I didn't understand what it felt like to be in his shoes. I walked closer, stopping just inches away so he had to look me in the eye. I told him I understood perfectly. He was terrified of starting over, but in his frantic effort to avoid that loss, he was willingly choosing to throw away everyone else. The mother who raised him, the father who built his career, and the grandparents who loved his son. I reminded him that I had spent 30 years building a name based on trust and loyalty, and because he stood behind that name, people assumed he shared those values. He was no longer that person, and the industry had realized it. For a single, fleeting second, his angry facade completely crumbled. He looked exactly like the 8-year-old boy who used to follow me around construction sites, wearing a plastic hard hat and asking a million questions because he wanted to grow up to be just like his dad. Every paternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to reach out, to put my arm around his shaking shoulders and to tell him we would find a way to fix this together, because family overrides everything. But I didn't move. I stood my ground. Logan saw my stillness, and the vulnerability instantly vanished from his eyes, replaced with a cold, hard resentment. He looked at me and said, "You're going to regret this." I knew exactly what was going to happen next. He would drive away, sit alone with his bitterness, and convince himself that I was the villain who ruined his life. He would never call or apologize, because his pride would view an apology as a total surrender, and he never learned the difference between the two. I told him that might be true, but I wasn't the one who was about to lose everything that actually mattered. Logan turned on his heel, marched back to his pickup truck, and slammed the door. He sat there for a long moment, with his hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel, the engine idling loudly. Part of me still held on to a desperate hope that he would turn the key off, step out of the truck, and come back into the garage to say the words that could save us. Instead, the truck threw into reverse, backed out of the driveway, and disappeared down the street. Martha quietly stepped out of the house, her eyes red from watching the entire confrontation through the kitchen window. She looked at the empty driveway and whispered that he was never going to forgive me for this. I wrapped my arm tightly around her shoulders and told her I knew. But the consequences that followed over the next few months were far more devastating than either of us could have predicted. By the time January arrived, the winter chill had firmly taken hold of the city. I was standing at the kitchen counter one morning when Arthur Brooks called me. His voice carried that heavy, overly careful tone people use when they are trying to break bad news gently. He told me he had just seen the official city bidding list for the municipal facility expansion project on Milestone Avenue. It was exactly the kind of mid-sized commercial contract Logan's firm used to secure effortlessly without even trying. I waited in silence for him to finish. Arthur sighed and told me that Logan's firm hadn't even made the initial selection shortlist. The city had awarded the entire contract to one of his main local competitors instead. He told me he thought I should know, and I thanked him quietly before hanging up the phone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the frosted window at the massive oak tree Martha had planted in our yard when Logan was just 3 years old. Its branches were completely bare against the gray winter sky, but its roots ran so deep into the earth that no amount of freezing wind was ever going to shake it. I chose not to mention the phone call to Martha. Logan's firm didn't collapse overnight in a sudden burst of drama. Instead, it slowly and quietly bled out over the next 6 months. As his existing commercial contracts reached completion, no new projects arrived to replace them. The future pipeline had completely dried up. His desk phone stopped ringing, and the office grew quiet. He desperately tried to adapt, expanding his search to smaller rural markets several counties away, but the regional construction network was far smaller than he realized. Word of mouth traveled fast, and without my name standing behind him, his reputation simply no longer carried the weight required to close major deals.
Evelyn walked out on him exactly 2 weeks before his firm officially closed its doors for good. She filed for divorce the very same week Logan confessed they would have to sell their large house on the west side, the one with the expansive manicured lawn and the 3-car garage that she had spent months decorating to impress her friends. She packed her things and moved across the state line. Later on, through a casual conversation with Clara Martinez, we learned that Evelyn had quickly connected with a wealthy corporate developer she had met through her real estate network, someone whose financial security wasn't falling apart. Within 6 months, she was engaged to be married again. It was Arthur Brooks who eventually told me that Logan had officially dissolved his business and locked the office doors for the last time. Logan himself never called, never visited, and never sent a message. Martha cried continuously for 3 days straight when she finally heard the news. She wasn't grieving the loss of the business itself. She was crying because she had finally accepted the brutal reality she had been trying to deny for months. She had lost her son. He hadn't passed away, and he hadn't moved to the other side of the world. He had simply chosen pride over his own family. And when that choice cost him his entire livelihood, he chose resentment over reconciliation. Our grandson, Mason, celebrated his 9th birthday that March. Logan didn't extend an invitation to the party, but Martha prepared a card for him anyway, slipping 2 crisp $100 bills inside. On the smooth cardstock, she carefully penned a simple message. "Happy birthday, Mason. We love you so much, Grandma and Grandpa." She reached out to Olivia, whose cousin happened to live just down the road from the modest apartment complex near the interstate where Logan had moved, and asked if she could ensure the envelope was delivered safely. Olivia called us 3 days later to confirm she had handed it directly to Logan at his door. He had offered a quiet thank you, but whether he ever showed the card to Mason or told him who it was from, we never discovered. Olivia later asked Martha, during one of their routine Wednesday afternoon lunches at the quiet diner on the edge of town, if she harbored any regrets about how everything unfolded. Martha sat in the booth, slowly pouring a splash of milk into her hot tea, watching the colors swirl together as she carefully gathered her thoughts. She wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic mug and admitted that she deeply regretted that it had to happen this way, but she firmly added that she did not regret that I had stood up for her. She looked at her friend and noted that no one else in that room had raised a hand to help, not even her own child. She confessed she had spent 2 long years making excuses for his behavior, convincing herself that she should just accept being treated like an afterthought, but it was never okay. Olivia simply nodded in understanding, allowing her friend to sit in the comfort of a supportive silence. Marcus and Chloe still came over to our house every single Saturday morning without fail. Marcus always arrived holding 2 cups of that notoriously bitter gas station coffee that tasted like it had been burning on the burner since the midnight shift.
They purposely avoided bringing up Logan's name unless Martha chose to speak of him first, which happened occasionally, usually when she caught sight of a young boy about Mason's age running through the aisles at the grocery store, or when she drove past the local elementary school and watched grandparents waiting in their cars at the pickup line. I immersed myself back into full-time consulting work, taking on a steady stream of new clients to keep my mind occupied. My professional standing in the community remained completely intact. Project managers and independent builders still called my line regularly whenever they needed guidance on complex contract disputes, labor negotiations, or handling difficult municipal boards. My name still commanded respect across the county. Logan's name, however, rarely came up in conversation anymore. On the rare occasions that someone did ask about him, they spoke with polite, hushed tones, expressing a vague hope that he was getting by before quickly changing the subject to something else. Then, in November, almost exactly 12 months to the day after that fateful birthday dinner, I crossed paths with Logan completely by accident. I was walking out of the local hardware store on the south side of town when I spotted him approaching from about 30 feet away. There was plenty of time and space for either of us to duck our heads, cross the street, and pretend we hadn't noticed each other to avoid an uncomfortable encounter. Neither of us did. We both slowed our pace and came to a stop right there on the concrete walkway. Two grown men who used to be father and son. Logan looked noticeably older, his frame thinner, and there was a profound exhaustion in his eyes that went far deeper than a simple lack of sleep. He was wearing the exact same winter jacket he'd owned for the past 3 years. It used to be his premium casual coat, but it was clear now that it had become his only coat. He looked at me, his voice very quiet, and called me Dad. I looked at him and acknowledged him by name. The traffic moved steadily on the street beside us, a dog barked in the distance, and the biting November wind was cold enough to sting our faces. Logan cleared his throat and asked how his mother was doing. I told her she was doing all right. He nodded slowly, processing my words, and murmured that he was glad to hear it. Another heavy silence stretched out between us. I could see his jaw tighten as he struggled to find the courage to voice whatever he had been carrying around inside him. He finally admitted. He thought about Mason a lot and wondered if the boy noticed that his grandparents had suddenly vanished from his life. He stopped for a second, swallowing hard, before confessing he still asked about us sometimes, wanting to know when we were going to go visit Grandpa again. The admission hit me right in the chest, exactly where he intended it to land. I looked at him and asked what he told the boy. Logan looked down at the sidewalk, his voice flat with an unmistakable shame he couldn't hide, and admitted he just told him we were busy. He added since he was only 9, he didn't push for answers. He just accepted it and moved on, noting that kids are resilient like that. I looked closely at my son, at the frayed edges of his jacket, the hollow look in his eyes, and the defeated way he stood, like a man who had completely forgotten how to occupy space in the world. Suddenly, the words broke out of him. Logan looked at me, his voice cracking with emotion, and said he was deeply sorry. He confessed he was sorry for failing to stand up for his mother. He admitted he knew exactly what Evelyn had been doing for years, but he had constantly lied to himself, believing it wasn't that severe and that Martha could handle it. He shook his head bitterly and noted it had exploded anyway. I felt that familiar tug deep within my chest, even more intense than it had been in the garage a year ago. My son was standing right in front of me, completely broken, entirely alone, and genuinely remorseful, finally uttering the exact words I had desperately needed to hear. Every paternal instinct I had developed over 36 years of raising this boy urged me to step forward, to place a reassuring hand on his shoulder, and to tell him that everything was going to be fine, that we would rebuild our lives because family was all that mattered. Yet I remained completely motionless. I simply told him that I knew he was sorry. Logan waited, hoping for more, but the silence between us stretched out across the pavement. A young couple strolled past us on the sidewalk, glancing over briefly as they felt the immense emotional weight hanging between us, though they couldn't possibly understand what it meant. Logan's voice dropped to a fragile whisper as he asked if there was any possible way back from this. He quickly clarified that he wasn't expecting everything to magically return to normal, nor was he asking us to pretend the damage had never been done. He just wanted to know if there was a door somewhere that he could at least start walking toward. I looked at my son for what felt like an eternity. I looked at the man who had allowed his own mother to be publicly degraded because he was too terrified of losing a wife he ended up losing anyway. He had lost his business, his home, and his social standing, and he was standing before me with absolutely nothing left but the bare truth. I told him honestly that I didn't have the answer to that question yet, but I firmly added that if a path to reconciliation did exist, it had to begin with his mother, not with me. I told him he needed to go see Martha, sit down with her, and willingly listen to every single thing she needed to say to him. Logan gave a sharp nod, his eyes filling with tears that he no longer tried to hide or wipe away. He whispered his agreement, and I told him to take care of himself before walking past him and stepping into the hardware store. I stood just inside the glass entrance for a long moment, staring blankly at the rows of tools. The pressure in my chest felt as though it had shifted. The situation wasn't resolved and the damage wasn't repaired, but it felt different. The specific way things feel when people finally stop pretending everything is fine. When I returned home that evening, Martha knew immediately that something significant had occurred. I sat down and recounted the entire encounter, detailing his apology, what he told Mason, and the boundary I had set at the hardware store. Martha sat at the kitchen table with both of her palms pressed flat against the smooth wood, her characteristic posture whenever she was processing something deeply important. She looked up at me, her eyes completely clear, and asked if I truly meant what I said about him starting with her. I told her I did. She nodded slowly and stated that she wanted to see her son. I reached across the table and took her hand, reminding her that whatever our relationship looked like going forward, it was going to be entirely different than before. She met my gaze steadily and noted that different didn't mean it was completely gone. Outside our window, the streetlights flickered on one by one, maintaining the exact same evening rhythm they had kept for 18 years in this neighborhood. Everything on our street looked precisely as it always had, but the large house at the far end of the block, the one Logan had been forced to sell before moving to the interstate apartment, belonged to completely new people now. I had watched a young couple with a newborn baby moving their furniture into the house a few weeks prior. They had waved at me from the yard, and I had waved back. The old life was completely gone. The innocence of Logan's childhood, the crowded birthday celebrations where everyone was welcome, and the lively family dinners where Martha cooked entirely too much food while the room echoed with laughter. What remained of our world was undeniably smaller and much quieter now. It consisted of just Martha and me, Marcus bringing over his terrible gas station coffee on Saturday mornings, Wednesday afternoon lunches with Olivia, and George Miller calling to complain about local building regulations. But it was a world where every single person left in it actively stood up for what was right when it mattered most. I gripped Martha's hand tightly, holding it the exact same way I had on the night we walked out of that dining room, and the way I had held her in the car when she finally revealed the 2 years of silent cruelties she had endured alone. Outside, the winter wind picked up, sending the bare branches of the massive oak tree scraping against the dark night sky. The tree Martha planted 28 years ago was still standing firm, its roots running deep enough to weather absolutely any storm that came its way. And for us, that was finally enough. If this story touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button. I share deep, meaningful stories every week about family, loyalty, and what happens when people finally find the strength to stand up for themselves. If you want to see another story about someone who refused to be disrespected, click the video on your screen right now. You won't regret it. Thanks for listening.